The morning of June 5th, 1944. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, 700 miles west of the Mariana Islands, Commander Edward Blakely pressed his eye against the periscope of the USS Shark. Through the narrow aperture, he watched a sight that would have terrified any merchant captain, a Japanese convoy cutting through the grey water, heavy with troops and supplies bound for Saipan. 7 merchantmen, arranged in 3 columns, their hulls riding low with the weight of reinforcements desperately needed to stop the American advance. 16 escort vessels surrounded them like nervous sheepdogs. Blakely knew what his targets carried. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications. The transports were loaded with soldiers from the 43rd Infantry Division. Every ship that reached Saipan meant more American Marines would die on those volcanic beaches. But that wasn't what made this moment extraordinary. What made it different was that Blakely wasn't attacking alone. Somewhere out in that vast expanse of ocean, 2 other American submarines were closing in on the same convoy. This was something new for the United States Navy. This was a wolf pack. For 3 years, the phrase wolf pack had meant only one thing: German U-boats prowling the North Atlantic, devastating Allied convoys with coordinated attacks that seemed to strike from nowhere and everywhere at once. Karl Dönitz's submarines had perfected the tactic, spreading terror across the shipping lanes between America and Britain. They hunted in groups, communicated by radio, and struck in overwhelming numbers. By 1943, they had sent millions of tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Now, in the summer of 1944, the Americans were about to prove they had learned the lesson. But the road to this moment hadn't been easy, and the story of how American submarines went from lone wolves to coordinated hunters reveals something fundamental about warfare itself: the difference between doctrine and reality, between what you think will work and what actually does work when men are drowning and torpedoes are running hot. The United States Navy entered World War II with confidence bordering on arrogance about submarine warfare. American submarine doctrine, developed over 2 decades of peacetime exercises, emphasized individual patrol areas and independent action. Each submarine captain was assigned his own sector of ocean, his own hunting ground. The thinking was straightforward. Give each commander maximum freedom to prosecute targets as he saw fit. American submarines were sophisticated machines with better living conditions, longer range, and superior fire control systems than their German counterparts. American officers were trained to be aggressive, independent decision-makers. Why would they need to coordinate? The doctrine reflected a particular American military philosophy. Unlike the highly centralized German command structure, where Admiral Dönitz personally directed U-boat movements from shore headquarters, the U.S. Navy trusted its submarine captains to operate independently once they left port. This wasn't just tactical preference, it was cultural. Americans valued individual initiative. The lone cowboy, the self-reliant frontiersman. These archetypes ran deep in the American psyche. Why shouldn't submarine warfare work the same way? But by late 1943, the results were speaking for themselves. And they weren't good. American submarines were sinking Japanese ships, yes, but not nearly enough. The Japanese merchant marine, though battered, was still functioning. Convoys were getting through. Supplies were reaching Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. The submarine force needed something more effective. The problem wasn't courage or skill. American submarine captains were among the most aggressive in the world. The problem was mathematics. A single submarine approaching a well-defended convoy faced daunting odds. Japanese escort vessels had radar, sonar, and depth charges. They knew how to screen their charges, how to force an attacking submarine deep and keep it there while the convoy escaped. A lone submarine might get off 1 attack, maybe 2 if the captain was brave and lucky. But then came the depth charges, the long evasion at crush depth, and by the time the submarine could surface again, the convoy would be gone. The German solution had proven devastatingly effective. Don't attack with 1 submarine. Attack with 8, or 10, or 12. spread them across the convoy's likely route. When one boat makes contact, it doesn't attack immediately. Instead, it shadows the target, reports its position, course, and speed, and waits for the others to converge. Then, when darkness falls and multiple submarines are in position, they strike simultaneously from different directions. The escorts can't be everywhere at once. Some submarines will be detected and forced deep, but others will break through. The convoy shatters, ships burn. By morning, the ocean is empty, except for wreckage. American submarine commanders had watched this devastation from the other side of the Atlantic. They had seen what coordinated attack groups could do. Some wondered why the U.S. Navy wasn't adopting the same tactics. The question eventually reached the highest levels of command, to Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded the submarine force in the Pacific from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Lockwood was an interesting figure, not your typical by-the-book admiral. He had started his career commanding submarines in World War I. He understood the unique psychology of submarine warfare, the claustrophobia and fear and strange intimacy of men sealed in a steel tube beneath the ocean. He also understood something more subtle, that peacetime doctrine often didn't survive contact with actual war. When thousands of men are dying and the stakes couldn't be higher, you don't cling to tradition if something better exists. In October 1943, Lockwood made his decision. The United States Navy would form its own wolf packs, but the American version would be different from the German model, where Dönitz controlled his U-boats through constant radio communication from shore, directing their movements like pieces on a chessboard. American wolf packs would be more autonomous. Each pack would consist of just 3 submarines, not 8 or 10. They would form up before leaving port, develop coordinated tactics during the voyage out, and be commanded by the senior captain among them, rather than by someone hundreds of miles away on shore. This hybrid approach reflected American pragmatism. The lessons of the Atlantic were clear. Coordination worked. But the Americans also recognized that the Pacific was not the Atlantic. Distances were vast. Radio silence was often essential. Weather could be violent and unpredictable. The Japanese, unlike the Germans, often sailed their convoys close to land, where submarines had less room to maneuver. A German-style centralized system simply wouldn't work. The American packs needed the freedom to adapt in real time to conditions that no shore-based commander could anticipate. The man chosen to develop and test these tactics was Captain Charles Momsen, known throughout the submarine force as Swede. Momsen was already legendary. In 1929, he had invented the Momsen lung, a breathing device that had saved the lives of 33 sailors trapped in the sunken submarine USS Squalus a decade later. Now, in 1943, he was being asked to solve a different problem: how to make American submarines hunt together. Momsen understood that the challenge wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Submarine commanders were strong-willed men, used to absolute authority over their boats. Getting 3 of them to work together, to subordinate their individual instincts to a coordinated plan, to share targets and glory, that wouldn't be easy. He would need to develop not just tactics, but trust. On October 1st, 1943, Momsen departed Midway Island aboard the USS Cerro, accompanied by 2 other submarines, Shad and Greyback. They were heading to patrol waters in the East China Sea, and they would be the first operational American wolf pack. Momsen himself served as the officer in tactical command, coordinating the 3 boats. It was a shakedown cruise, a test, and everyone knew the submarine force was watching. The first test came quickly. Just 4 days into the patrol, Momsen received an intelligence dispatch. A Japanese convoy was expected to pass through specific coordinates at noon on October 10th. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes, and this was the kind of advantage that could be war-winning if exploited properly. But exploitation required more than just knowing where the enemy would be. It required the 3 American submarines to work together. On the afternoon of October 10th, right where intelligence had predicted, the USS Greyback spotted smoke on the horizon. The convoy was there. This was the moment of truth. Would the American Wolfpack tactic work, or would it dissolve into confusion and missed opportunities? What happened next revealed both the promise and the problems of the new approach. Lieutenant Commander John Moore, captain of the Greyback, spotted the convoy and immediately attacked. His impulse was understandable. He saw targets, and submarine commanders were trained to be aggressive. Moore fired 4 torpedoes. One hit, damaging a cargo ship. But in his eagerness, Moore had violated the basic principle of Wolfpack tactics. He had attacked before notifying the other submarines in his pack. For the next 24 hours, Moore tried repeatedly to contact the Cerro and Shad, but communication failed. Whether it was equipment problems, atmospheric conditions, or some combination of factors, the coordination that was supposed to make the Wolfpack effective had broken down. The other submarines never got into position. The convoy escaped with minimal damage. The first American Wolfpack attack had been, at best, a partial success, and, at worst, a demonstration of all the things that could go wrong. But the Navy learned from failure. That was the point of these experimental patrols. Over the following months, tactics were refined, communication protocols were established. Most importantly, submarine captains learned to think differently, to see themselves as part of a team rather than as lone hunters. It was a subtle but profound psychological shift, and it didn't happen overnight. By the spring of 1944, American Wolfpacks were becoming more effective. Pack after pack departed Pearl Harbor, Donk's Devils, Ben's Busters, Ed's Eradicators. The names were informal, almost jovial, but the work was deadly serious. Each pack learned from the experiences of those that had gone before. Tactics evolved, communication improved, the coordination got tighter. Which brings us back to Captain Leon Blair and his blasters. By late May 1944, Blair's Wolfpack, consisting of the USS Shark, USS Pintado, and USS Pilotfish, was ready to depart on its first patrol. Blair himself would be aboard the Pintado, coordinating the pack's movements. The Shark was commanded by Edward Blakely, the Pintado by Bernard Clary, and the Pilotfish by Robert Close. 3 submarines, 3 captains, 1 shared mission. They departed Pearl Harbor on May 16th, refueled at Midway, and by late May were prowling waters west of the Marianas and south of Formosa. These were dangerous waters, heavily patrolled by Japanese aircraft and surface ships, but they were also rich hunting grounds. This was the highway between Japan and its southern empire, and along this route flowed the oil, rubber, food, and soldiers that kept Japan's war machine functioning. The timing was perfect, though Blair's blasters didn't know it yet. American forces were about to invade Saipan, a volcanic island in the Marianas that would bring B-29 bombers within range of Tokyo itself. The Japanese knew Saipan's importance, and they were rushing reinforcements there as fast as ships could carry them. Multiple convoys were being organized, loaded with troops, ammunition, and equipment. For Blair's blasters, it would be what submariners called a target-rich environment. On May 31st, at 5 in the morning, the USS Pintado received a radio message from Admiral Lockwood's headquarters. Another American submarine in the area, the USS Silversides, had spotted a Japanese convoy, 3 freighters and 4 escorts, heading east toward Saipan at 8 knots. The convoy's position, course, and speed were included in the message. This was ultra-intelligence at work, the invisible hand of American codebreakers guiding submarines toward their targets. By early evening, Blair's blasters had caught up with the convoy. But now came the difficult part, getting into attack position. The Japanese weren't cooperating. The convoy was zigzagging wildly, changing course every few minutes, in an unpredictable pattern. This wasn't random. It was anti-submarine doctrine, and it worked. A submarine needed to predict where a target would be in the 2 or 3 minutes it took for a torpedo to reach it. If the target kept changing course, that prediction became impossible. The Shark tried first. Commander Blakely maneuvered into what he thought was a good attack position, but the convoy zigged away at the last moment. He had to break off the approach. It was frustrating, watching valuable targets slip away, but this was where Wolfpack tactics showed their advantage. Because there were 3 submarines, not 1, there would be other chances. The Pintado was next. Captain Clary had been tracking the convoy, studying its movements, trying to discern a pattern in what seemed like chaos. At 4:37 in the morning on June 1st, he saw his opportunity. The convoy had steadied briefly on a predictable course. Clary gave the order to fire all 6 forward torpedoes. The range was 2,500 yards. The torpedoes, Mark 14s running at 46 knots, would take about 90 seconds to reach their targets. Clary watched through the periscope. The crew in the conning tower fell silent, listening. Every man aboard knew the drill. In 90 seconds, they would know if the attack had succeeded or if they had just given away their position for nothing. What happened next astonished everyone, including Clary himself. All 6 torpedoes hit. 5 slammed into a large freighter, the 10,000-ton Toho Maru, blowing it apart in a series of massive explosions. The 6th torpedo hit the smaller Kinshu Maru, causing heavy damage. It was perfect shooting, the kind of attack that submarine captains dream about but rarely achieve. But there was no time for celebration. The convoy's escorts were now fully alerted, racing toward the Pintado's last known position. Clary gave the order to dive, and the submarine went deep, rigging for silent running. Above them, the escorts began dropping depth charges, each one a thunderous explosion that shook the boat and sent shockwaves through the water. The crew held their breath, literally, because even heavy breathing could be picked up by Japanese hydrophones. This was the nightmare part of submarine warfare that never made it into the recruiting posters. You were blind, deaf, except for the pinging of enemy sonar, unable to fight back, just waiting and hoping that the next depth charge wouldn't be close enough to crack your hull open like an eggshell. The Pintado's crew endured 48 depth charges over the next half hour. Some were close, very close, close enough that paint flaked from the bulkheads and light bulbs shattered, but the hull held. Eventually, the escorts gave up and rejoined the convoy. The Pintado surfaced cautiously, checking the horizon for aircraft, and Clary sent a report to Blair and the other pack members. First blood to Blair's blasters. The wolf pack tactic was working. But this was just the beginning. What happened over the next 6 days would demonstrate the full potential of coordinated submarine attacks and would become a case study in submarine warfare for generations to come. The Japanese were sending multiple convoys towards Saipan, each one loaded with reinforcements. Blair's blasters were about to intercept them all. On June 2nd, early in the morning, the Shark picked up a new convoy on radar, 3 more freighters with 2 small escorts. This time, coordination worked better. The Shark radioed the other pack members, giving precise location and course information. But as Blakely maneuvered the Shark into attack position, the submarine was spotted by one of the escorts. The Japanese ship immediately altered course and raced toward them. Blakely had 2 choices: dive immediately and lose the attack, or stay on the surface and try to fire before the escort got too close. He chose aggression. The Shark remained surfaced, steadying on a firing course, and Blakely launched 4 torpedoes at the largest freighter in the convoy. The escorts immediately opened fire with their deck guns. Shells splashed in the water around the Shark as Blakely ordered an emergency dive. The submarine went under just as the escorts arrived at their firing position. 27 depth charges followed, but none were close. The Japanese were firing blind, attacking where they thought the submarine might be rather than where it actually was. 2 hours later, when the Shark cautiously surfaced, Blakely found the ocean empty. The convoy had escaped, or so it seemed, because while the Shark had been dodging depth charges, the pilot fish, which had been trailing behind, had received a message about yet another convoy. This one was big, 7 merchantmen in 3 columns, heavily escorted. Captain Close notified Blair, who immediately ordered all 3 submarines to converge on this new target. Early on Friday, June 2nd, the Wolfpack began coordinating for what would be a textbook attack. But as the Pintado approached the convoy, the submarine was spotted by one of the escorts. For the next half hour, the Pintado endured another depth charge attack, this one even more severe than the first. 48 depth charges exploded around the submarine as it twisted and turned at 300 feet, trying to evade. But here's where Wolfpack tactics showed their genius. While the escorts were focused on pummeling the Pintado, they left gaps in the convoy's defensive screen. The Shark, approaching from a different direction, found one of those gaps. Commander Blakely lined up on a large transport and fired 4 torpedoes late that evening. About a minute later, the first torpedo struck, then the second, then the third. The transport was hit by all 4 torpedoes, and the fourth one, missing the primary target, continued on and hit another freighter. 4 torpedoes, 4 hits, 2 ships damaged or sinking. It was the kind of coordination that the Germans had perfected and that the Americans were now mastering. The attacks continued through the night and into the next day. Blair's blasters had been tracking convoys for 72 hours, maneuvering for position, attacking when opportunities arose, coordinating their movements to maximize damage while minimizing risk. On the afternoon of June 3rd, the Shark located yet another convoy inbound for Saipan. This one included something particularly valuable, a troop transport carrying reinforcements. The pilotfish was supposed to take the lead on this attack, but the convoy unexpectedly changed course, spoiling Captain Close's approach. However, it also drove the enemy ships directly at the Shark. Blakely tracked the convoy until he had what submariners call a perfect setup, good firing solution, clear shot, multiple targets overlapping. At the optimal moment, he fired 4 torpedoes at the transport Katsukawa Maru. All 4 hit. The ship, carrying nearly 3,000 Japanese soldiers bound for Saipan, broke apart and sank in minutes. Most of the troops went down with it. Blakely later wrote in his report that it was unbelievable how fast a ship could sink. One moment it was there, a massive steel vessel cutting through the water. The next moment, it was gone, and the ocean was empty, except for debris and a few desperate swimmers. Throughout that evening and into June 5th, Blair's blasters stayed within range of the convoy. The escorts were frantic now, dropping depth charges at the slightest sonar contact, but they were overwhelmed. There were 3 submarines out there, attacking from different directions, surfacing and submerging unpredictably. The escorts couldn't be everywhere at once. Early on the night of June 5th, the Shark fired 6 more torpedoes at the convoy. These strikes sank both the 7,000-ton Takaoka Maru, carrying 3,500 troops, and the smaller freighter Tamahime Maru. With each sinking, hundreds of Japanese soldiers died, men who would never reach Saipan, never reinforce its garrison, never fire a rifle at American Marines coming ashore. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The next day, June 6th, while American forces were storming the beaches of Normandy half a world away, Captain Clary aboard the Pintado spotted another target. Just after midnight, he fired 4 stern torpedoes at a freighter. All 4 missed their intended target but struck another Japanese merchantman, causing heavy damage. Later that morning, Clary fired 6 forward torpedoes and scored 6 hits, sinking 2 more ships. The Japanese escorts were determined to exact revenge. They boxed in the Pintado and unleashed 50 depth charges. Some were very close enough that the submarine's crew thought this might be the end. A depth charge exploded so near that it knocked lockers open, damaged equipment, and hurled a file drawer onto Captain Blair's head. But the hull held. The Pintado survived, limped away at 300 feet, and by mid-afternoon the escorts had given up and moved on. When Blair finally compiled his report for Admiral Lockwood, the statistics were remarkable. Over 7 days and 7 nights, his Wolfpack had made 28 end-around maneuvers, 23 approaches to convoys, and 6 attacks. They had fired 30 torpedoes and scored 30 hits. It was a performance that remained unmatched in the annals of submarine warfare. But perhaps the most telling detail was this. The pilotfish, one of the 3 submarines in the pack, never fired a single torpedo, yet the patrol was still considered a spectacular success. Why? Because the pilotfish had played its role. It had tracked convoys, reported positions, drawn off escorts, created opportunities for the other submarines to attack. In a wolf pack, success wasn't measured by individual glory but by collective results. This represented a fundamental shift in how American submarine warfare was conducted. Before wolf packs, success meant how many ships you sank personally. After wolf packs, success meant how many ships the pack sank together. For American submarine captains, trained to be aggressive individualists, this was a profound psychological transformation. The impact went beyond tactics. When news of Blair's blasters' success reached Pearl Harbor, it validated Admiral Lockwood's decision to adopt wolfpack tactics. More packs were formed. More convoys were hunted. The coordination improved with each patrol. By the summer of 1944, American submarine wolf packs were operating throughout the Pacific, and the Japanese merchant marine was hemorrhaging tonnage it couldn't replace. Consider what this meant for Japan's war effort. Every transport that sank took its cargo to the bottom. Tanks, ammunition, food, fuel, soldiers. A Japanese Zero fighter in combat consumed as much as 1,500 gallons of fuel per week. A single tank regiment could burn through 2,000 gallons per hour. When submarines sank tankers, they weren't just destroying ships. They were starving the Japanese war machine of the oil it needed to function. The numbers tell a story of systematic strangulation. In 1942, bulk commodities reaching Japan totaled about 19.4 million tons. By 1943, that figure had dropped to 16.4 million tons. In 1944, the year Blair's blasters conducted their patrol, American submarines sank 603 Japanese merchant ships, totaling about 2.7 million tons. That was more tonnage than had been sunk in the first 25 months of the war combined. Think about what those numbers meant in practical terms. Every tanker sunk was oil that would never reach Japanese refineries. Every transport lost was rubber that would never be manufactured into tires, iron ore that would never be smelted into steel, rice that would never feed Japanese soldiers. The Japanese economy was being throttled, one sunken ship at a time. By the end of 1944, Japanese merchant tonnage had fallen to approximately 2 million tons, barely enough to meet the food supply needs of the home islands. Japan was being starved, not by strategic bombing or naval blockade in the traditional sense, but by submarines prowling beneath the surface, coordinating their attacks, hunting in packs. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Japanese merchant sailors knew that American submarines were out there, hunting in packs, coordinating their attacks with deadly precision. Convoy duty became a sentence of terror. You sailed, knowing that at any moment, without warning, torpedoes might slam into your hull. And if your ship sank in deep water far from land, your chances of survival were minimal. Many Japanese merchant ships began sailing close to shore, hugging coastlines where the water was too shallow for submarines to operate. But this meant longer voyages, more fuel consumed, more time exposed to American aircraft. Japanese naval leadership had made a critical error from the beginning of the war. Unlike the British and Americans, who had learned harsh lessons about convoy protection during World War I and the Battle of the Atlantic, Japanese admirals viewed convoy escort duty as defensive and therefore dishonorable. The samurai spirit emphasized offense, attack, decisive battle. Protecting merchant ships seemed beneath the dignity of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This cultural blind spot would prove catastrophic. When Japan finally did begin organizing proper convoy systems in late 1943, it was too late. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes. Every convoy route, every departure time, every destination was known to American intelligence before the ships even left port. Japanese escort vessels, called kaibokan, were competent enough, with decent sonar and adequate depth charges. But they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of American submarines and the sophistication of wolfpack tactics. For the crews of Blair's blasters, returning to Pearl Harbor in mid-June 1944 was a moment of vindication. They had proven that American submarines could coordinate as effectively as German U-boats. They had developed tactics that worked in the unique conditions of the Pacific. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that the doctrines America entered the war with could evolve, could change, could incorporate lessons from both allies and enemies. But success came at a cost, and not just to the Japanese. The submarine service had the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military during World War II. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. 3,506 men went down with them. That represented approximately 20% of all submarine personnel who saw combat, the highest casualty percentage of any American service. For submariners, death came in specific, terrible ways. Sometimes it was sudden, a direct hit from a depth charge that crushed the pressure hull like a tin can, killing everyone instantly as seawater exploded into the boat at crushing pressure. Sometimes it was slower, the submarine damaged and unable to surface, air growing stale as carbon dioxide built up, men waiting for the end. Sometimes it was fire, always the most terrifying threat in an enclosed space with no escape. And sometimes it was the simple mathematics of war. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a Japanese destroyer found you. The USS Shark herself, after her triumphant first patrol with Blair's blasters, would depart on a third patrol in October 1944 and never be seen again. Japanese records examined after the war revealed that the destroyer Harukaze had depth-charged and sunk an American submarine in Luzon Strait on October 24th. The Shark went down with all 87 men aboard. Commander Edward Blakely, who had commanded the Shark so skillfully during the June convoy attacks, died with his crew. He was 35 years old. The loss of the Shark was just one of many. That fall of 1944 was particularly brutal for American submarines. Between late September and early November, the United States lost 8 submarines in just 6 weeks, the highest loss rate of the entire war. The Japanese had finally developed more effective escort tactics. Their radar and sonar had improved, and their escort vessels were now more numerous and better trained. Each lost submarine represented more than just a vessel. It was an entire community, 70 or 80 men who had lived together in the most intimate circumstances imaginable. In a submarine, you couldn't escape your crewmates. You slept in bunks, stacked 3 high with just 18 inches of clearance. You breathed recycled air that always smelled of diesel fuel, cooking, unwashed bodies, and the chemical scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide. You showered rarely because fresh water was precious. You lived with constant noise, the hum of electric motors, the ping of enemy sonar, the click and whir of the torpedo data computer. And yet, submarine crews developed extraordinary bonds. They had to trust each other absolutely. One man making a mistake, one oversight, one moment of inattention could kill everyone aboard. This created a culture of professionalism and mutual dependence that went beyond normal military camaraderie. When a submarine was lost, it wasn't just individual deaths, it was the destruction of a complete social world. The Navy tried to soften the psychological impact of submarine service. After each patrol, crews were sent to rest camps for 2 weeks, places where they could forget about the war, sleep in real beds, eat fresh food, and try to process what they had experienced. Admiral Lockwood insisted on these rest periods despite criticism from some who thought it was coddling. But Lockwood understood that submarine warfare imposed unique psychological demands. The constant tension of knowing that at any moment you might be detected, the terror of depth charge attacks, the claustrophobia, the responsibility of sending enemy ships to the bottom with hundreds or thousands of men aboard, these things accumulated, and without relief, men would break. By 1945, the submarine campaign had reached its climax. American wolf packs were operating with devastating efficiency throughout Japanese waters, but paradoxically, there were fewer targets. So much of the Japanese merchant marine had been sunk that convoys were smaller, less frequent, and often confined to coastal waters where submarines couldn't easily operate. The Japanese economy was in collapse. Cities were being bombed by B-29s flying from the Marianas, the very islands Blair's blasters had helped to secure by sinking the convoys bound for Saipan. In total, American submarines sank 1,113 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 4.7 million tons. They also sank 201 Japanese naval vessels, including a battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. Of all Japanese merchant and naval losses during World War II, submarines accounted for 54.6%. No other single weapon system had a comparable impact on the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted after the war, concluded that the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping was perhaps the most decisive single factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and the logistical support of Japanese military power. Japan was an island nation dependent on imports for survival. Oil came from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron ore from China and Southeast Asia. When submarines cut those supply lines, Japan slowly suffocated. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the nation's merchant marine had been virtually annihilated. Ships that would have taken years to build had been sent to the bottom in minutes. When Allied occupation forces arrived in Japan in September, they found a nation with almost no functional shipping except fishing boats. The destruction was so complete, so total, that it had no parallel in maritime history. But there was irony in this achievement. The Americans had learned wolf-pack tactics from the Germans, the very enemy they were fighting in Europe. German U-boats had shown what coordinated submarine attacks could accomplish, and the Americans had adapted those lessons to the Pacific. In doing so, they demonstrated something fundamental about warfare: that good ideas transcend nationality, that effective tactics can be learned from anyone, even enemies, and that adaptability matters more than pride. The story of Blair's blasters and the American wolf packs also reveals something about military institutions. Peacetime doctrine, no matter how carefully developed, often fails when it encounters the chaos of actual war. The American submarine force entered World War II believing in independent patrols and individual initiative. These were good values, but they weren't enough. When it became clear that coordination was more effective than independence, the Navy changed. It didn't cling stubbornly to doctrine. It didn't let pride or tradition prevent adaptation. It looked at what worked, incorporated those lessons, and became more effective. This capacity for institutional learning, for honest assessment of what was working and what wasn't, may have been as important as any technological advantage. The Japanese, by contrast, struggled to adapt. Their cultural emphasis on the offensive, their disdain for defensive operations like convoy escort, their slow recognition of how devastating submarine warfare could be, these factors contributed significantly to their defeat. There's also a human cost that statistics can't fully capture. 3,506 American submariners never came home. Tens of thousands of Japanese merchant sailors died when their ships were torpedoed. Tens of thousands more Japanese soldiers drowned in troopships that never reached their destinations. These weren't combatants in the traditional sense. Many were young men drafted into service, sailing on ships they'd never wanted to board, fighting a war they might not have believed in. War reduces human beings to targets, to statistics, to acceptable losses. A submarine captain looking through a periscope sees a ship, a target, an objective to be destroyed. He doesn't see the individual men aboard, doesn't know their names or their families or their dreams. He can't afford to. If he did, if he allowed himself to fully grasp the human cost of each torpedo he fired, he might not be able to fire at all. And yet, these were the choices men faced. Admiral Lockwood, Captain Blair, Commander Blakely, and thousands of others had to make decisions that would result in death on a massive scale. They did so because they believed, rightly or wrongly, that their cause was just, that stopping Japan required these actions, that the alternative allowing the war to continue would result in even greater suffering. By the time the war ended, American submarines had conducted 1,588 war patrols. Each patrol lasted 45 to 60 days. Each one was a test of endurance, courage, and luck. Some submarines completed a dozen patrols or more. Others were lost on their first. The difference between coming home and never being seen again was sometimes nothing more than chance. You happened to dive 10 seconds earlier than another submarine would have. You happen to be in a different patch of ocean when the Japanese destroyer passed through. Your torpedo happened to run true when another submarine's might have malfunctioned. For the survivors, the war left marks that never fully healed. Men who had endured depth charge attacks sometimes woke decades later, sweating, hearing the sound of explosions, feeling the submarine shudder around them. Men who had fired torpedoes into troopships wondered, in quiet moments, about the soldiers they had killed, whether those men had families, whether they died quickly or drowned slowly in the dark water. But there was also pride. The submarine service had accomplished what many thought impossible. They had learned from their mistakes, adapted German tactics to Pacific conditions, and systematically destroyed an empire's ability to wage war. They had done so with a casualty rate that, while high, was remarkably low considering the dangers they faced. And they had proven that even the most stubborn institutional cultures could change when survival demanded it. The Wolfpack tactics that Blair's blasters exemplified didn't just sink ships. They represented a kind of warfare that required coordination, communication, and trust among independent commanders. In that sense, they were quintessentially American, combining individual initiative with collective action, balancing freedom with discipline, recognizing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is work together. When Commander Blakely stood at the periscope of the USS Shark on that June morning in 1944, watching a Japanese convoy steam into range, he was participating in something larger than he probably realized. He was part of a campaign that would help end the largest war in human history. The torpedoes his submarine and others like it fired were writing the final chapter of Japan's empire, one sunken ship at a time. Those 11 minutes that a Japanese admiral might have had between spotting a Wolfpack's periscopes and the first torpedoes arriving, those were minutes of recognition, of understanding that something had changed in submarine warfare, that the Americans had learned to hunt in packs, and that the outcome of battles was no longer predetermined by who had the larger fleet or the more powerful battleships. Wars could be won beneath the surface, in the dark waters where submarines prowled, communicating in coded radio messages, coordinating attacks across miles of ocean, turning the sea itself into a weapon. The legacy of Wolfpack tactics would continue long after World War II ended. During the Cold War, American and Soviet submarines would develop even more sophisticated coordination methods. Modern submarine warfare still emphasizes many of the lessons learned in the Pacific: the importance of intelligence, the value of coordination, the need for commanders who can balance individual initiative with collective objectives. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler and more human. The men who served aboard submarines like the Shark, the Pintado, and the Pilotfish demonstrated extraordinary courage in the most claustrophobic, terrifying conditions imaginable. They went to war in steel tubes beneath the ocean, knowing that if something went wrong, there would be no rescue, no second chances. They did so because they believed it mattered, because their country asked them to, and because the alternative seemed worse. And they succeeded. Not perfectly, not without terrible cost, but they succeeded in ways that changed the course of the war and proved that even the most entrenched doctrines could evolve, that good ideas could come from anywhere, even enemies, and that Americans could learn, adapt, and overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.